Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar on the updates to the clinical trials announcements. In particular, today we'll be talking about pilot effectiveness research and research in mental health systems and services. With me today, I'm Pat Arian. I am the director for the Division of Services and Interventions Research. And with me is Joel Sherrill, who is the Deputy Director, Mary Rooney, who is in our Treatment, Interventions, and Prevention branch, Sharzad Mavandati, who's in the Services and Clinical Epidemiology branch, Eileen Schulte, Nick Gaiano, and Tamara Keys, who are in the Division of Extramural Activities. Please use the Zoom and Q&A feature to post any questions. Participants can enter questions at any time during the presentations. However, we will be taking additional questions at the end of the presentation. And we are recording this webinar, and we will send out an email blast as to where it will be hosted so that your colleagues, you can share this with your colleagues, or you can come back and take a look at what our discussion was today. I do want to apologize for the very quick turnaround in terms of the announcement of this webinar and when it was hosted. Events beyond our control, but we're glad to see that some of you have been able to make it today. So I'm just going to give an overview about the reason for the changes to the clinical suite of clinical trials PARs that specifically that are funded under the Division of Services and Interventions Research. I'm also going, then we're going to go over the specific changes to pilot effectiveness announcement, an overview of the new services and systems research announcement, and then Dr. Sherrill will go over the simplified peer review, an overview of Forms I, which is also new, and then we'll take your questions. So in coming to DISR last year, the DISR staff and I did a quick review of our portfolio, and in particular, the budgets for the R34 pilot effectiveness studies and the yield of the R01 effectiveness and services announcement in terms of how many applications we were getting specifically in service and system level interventions research. The R34 amount, and our summary is basically this, the R34 amount has not kept up with the cost of living. Intervention and adaptation study designs are far more complex than they used to be, and therefore we felt that this is an opportunity for us to right-size the funding for this particular type of research. Effectiveness research and services research have different purposes and focus on different targets. Effectiveness is focused on the individual or the organism. Services is focused on the systems of care or the organization. We still encourage a mechanistic hypothesis in both types of trials, but the methods used to study mechanisms and system-level interventions are different than the methods used to study therapeutic mechanisms. So we felt it was important to have a separate RFA or PAR for clinical trials to study systems and services interventions so that we can clarify what we mean by mechanistic studies in the two different types of trials. Another reason for why we wanted to separate out the services and systems level interventions research is that we feel very strongly about partnership building and systems research. And we feel this is highly critical and are encouraging a more thoughtful partnership process moving forward so that we can deploy best practices as soon as possible. In both cases, we did a thorough review of funding mechanisms that would address the cost of living challenges, provide more support for partnership building, and hopefully will speed the translation of science into service. And that is the rationale for our changes to these particular trial announcements. So now I'm going to hand this over to Mary Rooney, who will talk about the changes to the pilot effectiveness research. Mary?
Great. Thank you, Pat. Yes, as Pat mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the pilot effectiveness research announcement, specifically pilot hybrid effectiveness implementation trials for our mental health interventions. Next slide. So I'll quickly recap the purpose of this announcement, which is to solicit pilot hybrid effectiveness implementation research that's consistent with NIMH's priorities for refining and optimizing preventive and therapeutic interventions with previously demonstrated efficacy for use with broader target populations, or for delivery in routine care, school, community, or online settings, as well as research on implementation strategies that support the delivery and sustainability of evidence-supported interventions in accessible settings. With our reissue of this announcement, as Pat mentioned, the largest changes really are to the budget and the funding mechanism. And there's one change to the scope. So starting with the funding mechanism, in the previous version, this was an R34 announcement. With the increase in the budget, this is now an R01 mechanism. However, the scale and scope of the research stays squarely focused in the pilot domain, as I just described, with an emphasis on assessing the feasibility, acceptability of the approach, and generating the preliminary data that is needed to support a well-powered, full-scale R01 trial in the future. And the direct costs for the project have now increased to a total of $750,000 over the course of the full budget period, which is 3 years. And it also utilizes a modular budget, even though it's an R01. In terms of the scope of the research we're soliciting, it remains largely unchanged, except that we are now requiring the inclusion of a pilot hybrid effectiveness trial, which by definition includes methods for evaluating intervention effectiveness as well as implementation factors. And in our prior version, this was something that we encouraged, but it wasn't something that was required. So that's a pretty significant change and something to attend to, because it will be something we'll be looking at in terms of whether or not the application is responsive to the funding opportunity announcement. And lastly, one additional very important point to note is that this announcement, because we have switched from an R34 mechanism to an R01 mechanism, we will not be able to allow resubmissions. So if you have an application that you submitted and was reviewed under the R34 mechanism, you will need to submit a new application under the R01 mechanism. You will not be able to submit a resubmission from your prior application. And those are the key points. At the end, I'm happy to take additional questions through the Q&A.
Great.
Next slide.
Yes, thank you, Mary. Now I'm going to hand this over to Sharzad Mavandati.
Yes, thank you. So I'm pleased to provide a brief introduction to a new clinical trials funding announcement, effectiveness trials to test health system interventions. So the purpose of this funding opportunity is that it uses an R61, R33 exploratory developmental phased award mechanism to support milestone-driven feasibility and infrastructure development during the R61 phase, followed by a well-powered clinical trial during the R33 phase. So in this instance, the R33 is not considered developmental, but really rather should be used to test the effectiveness of system interventions or implementation strategies. So in terms of the award information, please note application budgets are not limited or capped and should reflect the needs of the proposed work. And the award cannot exceed 5 years. And that includes a maximum of up to 2 years for the R61 phase, followed by a maximum of 4 years for the R33 phase. And the scope of the project really should determine the project period for each of those phases. Next slide, please. So just to provide a brief context for the research supported by this announcement, so system interventions are operationalized as those that target systems of care, as Pat mentioned, rather than individuals, and attend to issues such as access and adoption, delivery and organization, utilization, and quality mental health services, with the ultimate goal really of improved clinical, functional, or population-level outcomes. So the focus of the intervention could be across multiple organizational systems or settings, or at multiple levels within a single organization or setting. Finally, the research and methods proposed here should really go beyond assessing whether the intervention is effective or not, and should advance our understanding of and test specifically how, why, for whom, or in what settings or circumstances the system intervention may be effective, and make sure to include a detailed analytic plan and the specific variables that can be used to address those questions. Next slide. So when preparing your application, this is a bit different. We're switching to the R6133. So it'll be important to take into account the biphasic nature of the award and follow any specific instructions that are listed in the funded announcement or in the published announcement. The R61 phase is typically a 1 to 2 year planning phase that largely focuses on collecting feasibility data and establishing the infrastructure that will be needed for the conduct of the R33 clinical trial. So applications must include a plan that delineates R61 milestones that signify the completion of major elements that are going to be necessary to support the larger scale project that's being proposed in the R33. These milestones should include a description of well-defined, quantifiable, achievable, justifiable, scientifically justified benchmarks, deliverables, thresholds that will allow program staff to assess progress during the R61 phase, and also that will establish the feasibility and the empirical basis for pursuing the R33 work. So activities may be varied. It really depends on the focus of the intervention and the stage of intervention development. The activities can include collecting feasibility or pilot data for the intervention or intervention components in situations where preliminary data are not available, developing research practice partnerships, as Dr. Arian mentioned, and engaging with the community and clinical collaborators and end users to ensure intervention appropriateness and feasibility and potential sustainability and scalability, demonstrating ability to access key data sets, and finally, demonstrating the feasibility of recruiting, retaining, and randomizing participants for the trial that's being proposed in the R33, which brings us to that phase. So the R33 really is to provide the definitive test of and test the effectiveness of that system intervention or implementation strategies that are being refined during the R61. So for transition to this phase, investigators will need to submit a package that includes a progress report summarizing achievement of milestones, and that material will be evaluated by NIMH staff, program staff, and to help inform R33 funding decisions. And again, when preparing your application, please do be mindful of those specific instructions for application submission that pertain to the information that's necessary and the formatting for the 2 phases of the project. Next slide. And then finally, I just want to end with a quick summary of the types of studies that would not be a response to this funding announcement and, if submitted, unfortunately, would not be reviewed or considered for funding. And these would include applications that don't explicitly test how or in what circumstances the intervention may be effective, and again, do not include the analytic plan and specification of variables. Applications that propose to test interventions or implementation strategies in academic research settings as opposed to routine clinical care or community settings. Those that propose to test implementation strategies that focus only on the individual level. Again, there's other funding announcements that are more appropriate for that work. And then finally, applications that propose health literacy interventions without specifically examining the impact on factors like access and engagement or outcomes of care. And of course, if you have any questions, again, regarding responsiveness and program priorities that relate to this announcement, please feel free to reach out. And
thank you. Thank you so much. So now I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Sherrill to discuss the simplified peer review framework.
Okay, thank you. So next, our plan is to very briefly highlight a few NIH changes to the application and review processes. And we note that these changes are not specific to these particular PARs. Rather, in both cases, these are NIH level changes that apply to applications submitted on or after January 25th, 2025. So we're flagging these changes because they'll apply to the first receipt date for the PARs we're covering in this webinar. So first, based on input from the field, NIH developed revisions to the peer review process and a simplified framework for NIH peer review criteria. As described in Notice OD 24-010, the new framework for peer review applies to various project grant applications submitted on or after January 25th, 2025. The simplified review framework is intended to focus reviewers on key questions, specifically, should the proposed research be conducted, and can the proposed research project be conducted? So should it be conducted, and can it be conducted? Next slide, please. So the simplified framework for NIH peer review reorganizes the former 5 regulatory review criteria into 3 factors. The Significance and innovation criteria are now included under Factor 1 importance. The approach criterion is now included under Factor 2, which covers the approach, rigor, and feasibility. And the investigators and environment criteria are now included under Factor 3, which includes expertise and resources. So this reframing focuses reviewers on three central questions. Factor 1, how important is the proposed research? Factor 2, how rigorous and feasible are the methods? And Factor 3, whether the investigators in the institution have the expertise and the resources necessary to carry out the project. Next slide, please. Next, notice OD 24-086 informs applicants of changes to the grant application forms and the application guide instructions, specifically a transition from Forms H to Forms I for applications again submitted for due dates on or after January 25th, 2025. Next slide, please. The application guides and for Forms I application packages are posted to the How to Apply application guide. And again, because these effectiveness and system intervention PARs we're covering in this webinar today have initial receipt dates after January 25th, 2025, these PARs are posted with Forms I forms. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, some key changes to research project grants under Forms I are outlined in Notice OD 24-086, and these include a new attachment field for the recruitment plan to enhance diversity on the PHS 398 Research Training Program plan, and required use of common forms for biographical sketch and current and pending other support. Again, these application packages are attached to these new PARs. Next slide, please. And then briefly before we take questions about the effectiveness and systems intervention PARs, next we thought we would summarize and compare the PARs to help address some potential questions about how to decide which PAR to use based on the nature of the intervention you're studying, the stage of science, etc. Next slide, please. In terms of the nature of the intervention, the pilot effectiveness and full-scale hybrid effectiveness PARs are relevant for testing preventive and therapeutic interventions across modalities that includes pharmacological interventions, psychosocial interventions, digitally facilitated interventions, combinations of interventions, etc. And they're also relevant for testing other interventions that target the behavior of individuals. So, for example, interventions to promote service use through users' access to or engagement in mental health services, and implementation strategies that target provider behavior for training or supervision strategies, for example. In contrast, the systems intervention PR is used for interventions that target systems rather than individuals, as Shahrzad said. The focus could be at multiple levels within the system, including the service user, provider, and the system. Next slide, please. In terms of the stage of intervention development across these PARs, for effectiveness trials testing individual level interventions, the pilot hybrid effectiveness implementation PAR is used for early stage pilot testing, while the full-scale effectiveness implementation PAR is used for trials that are informed by pilot data and designed and powered to definitively test effectiveness. The systems level intervention PAR uses a phased milestone-driven approach to move from feasibility to full-scale testing. The R61 phase involves milestone-driven feasibility and infrastructure development. The R33 phase involves trials that are designed and powered to definitively test effectiveness. Next slide, please. Relatedly, the goals of the trial differ depending on the stage of intervention development and testing. For pilot hybrid trials, effectiveness trials, the goals involve examining feasibility of the intervention strategy, a preliminary evaluation of the intervention's impact on outcomes in at least one hypothesized mechanism, and importantly, collecting data needed in support of a subsequent definitive trial. The full-scale hybrid effectiveness implementation trial should be designed and powered to test outcomes, examine mechanisms, and examine factors that impact implementation. And the phased system intervention PAR project should focus first on establishing feasibility and establishing partnerships and preliminary examination of effectiveness. And then in the R33 phase, definitively testing the intervention's effectiveness and examining factors that account for or moderate the effectiveness. Next slide, please. The PARs also differ in terms of the prerequisite data that are required for each application. For the pilot effectiveness implementation PAR, pilot data regarding the effectiveness of the intervention are not required. Rather, pilot testing is in fact the goal of these projects, but information supporting the feasibility of conducting the pilot work in the practice setting is important to include. For the full-scale effectiveness implementation PARs, there should be pilot data regarding the intervention's effectiveness in support of the hypotheses. And for the phase system intervention PAR, the prerequisite information differs for each phase. For the R61 phase, there should be some prior evidence supporting the feasibility of completing the work in the practice setting. For the R33 phase, the prerequisite information comes from having met the R61 milestones, including evidence supporting the feasibility of engaging practices and practice partners and feasibility of enrollment, etc., and pilot data regarding the intervention's effectiveness in support of the R33 hypotheses. Next slide, please. Finally, the PRs differ in terms of the project period based on the scope of work. So for the pilot effectiveness implementation PAR, these modular R01s are limited to no more than 3 years. For the full-scale effectiveness implementation trials, the project period should be justified based on the scope of the work, and the maximum project period is 5 years. For the phase system intervention PAR, the maximum project period is 5 years. But depending on the current state of the intervention's development, applicants have some flexibility. The R61 can be 1 to 2 years, and the R33 can be 3 to 4 years. Next slide, please. We really want to emphasize that the information that Dr. Rooney and Dr. Mavandati presented is included in the PARs, in the announcement. All the information is included in the announcement. This is merely a summary today. And we want to emphasize the importance of reviewing all the sections of the PARs before applying. For example, Section 1 describes the background and purpose of the PAR and details the scope of research, including examples of responsive and non-responsive studies. Section 4 includes very critical information about what to include in the research section and in the application. These are the application instructions in order to build and submit a responsive application. And in parallel, in Section 5, reviewers are asked to address review criteria specific to the PAR. The review criteria in Section 5 parallel the instructions in Section 4, so it behooves all applicants to review the instructions and these review criteria to ensure that their applications are responsive and complete. And we also want to note that for each of these announcements, program contacts are listed at the end. And we always encourage potential applicants to contact us as far in advance as possible before submitting an application to discuss the match to NIMH priorities and the match to these various PARs that we use for effectiveness and system intervention research. And we recommend that you start that process by emailing the program contacts listed in the announcements, a brief 1 to 2 page description of the project you're considering so you can follow up with discussion. Okay, I think that moves us to our question and answers, and we will be taking a look at what you all are entering in the question and answer function in Zoom. Not seeing anything right away, but we'll give it a moment.
Yep. I don't see any I don't see any questions either. So this is your opportunity to add it. We have a little bit of time. Um,
Okay,
Okay.
I'm seeing a hand raised, but we're asking that you put your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, please.
Do you all see where that is? Oh, if we can't answer my question if you can't see it. So, well, given that there's nothing popping up, maybe we could take raised hands and just let's see. Maybe we can unmute Dr. Repo Feinmind.
I'm not a doctor, but thank you so much. I was just saying there's no way for us to post any questions. It's all disabled. We can't post in the chat. Hence, there are no questions to be posted.
I'm so sorry about that. We see the Q&A on our side, and so I'm not sure why you guys aren't seeing that, but I apologize. Given that, then if that's your only comment, I'll move to Dr. Taxel. If we can unmute him, please. Thanks.
Hi. Yes, that was my thing. For us, the chat is disabled, the question answer is disabled. So we are not able to type in anything and we cannot unmute ourselves. So we cannot say anything.
Okay. Do you have a question for us?
Um, yes, I did. Right in the beginning, there was a slide which mentioned something about modular budgets. It was, I think,
Yeah.
the first or the second slide in the
Yeah.
entire presentation.
That is in regards to the pilot of effectiveness R01.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And so what that means is that the each year is capped by do you remember, Mary? Do you want to take that? But yeah, and you don't have to write a detailed budget with a modular budget. You do have to write a justification, but you basically ask for, no more than 225. Is that right, Mary? Do you remember the number?
I believe it's 250
250.
a year
50. 250,
in
that's
direct
right.
cost.
That's right.
Okay. I did have one more question, and I will sort of unmute myself after that. My last question is that is there any platform on the NIH website through which we can understand the assist process, how to actually submit the applications? Because I understand they take a lot of time. It takes about 5, 6 weeks to complete the NIH form for any submission, and there are a lot of details that are required. So is there like an upcoming webinar or any resource material on how to fill in the application?
There are various resources on the NIH website about the submission process, and that's probably the best place for an introduction to the process. Also, if you're with a university or a research center that has a research office or a business office, they can be an excellent resource for helping you with the application information.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And I just want to say, Eric, the Q&A is open now, so you can add your question there. I'm going to go to Jen Boggs, who wanted examples of implementation strategy outcomes at the systems level for the R6133 versus implementation strategies measured at the provider level for the R01. So the best way I think to think about the system levels R6133 is that many of the implementation strategies that are being combined to address access, quality, cost, of care probably have already been tested as specific implementation strategies. So, for example, provider training would be an example of, like say a hybrid type 3 comparing two different types of training strategies to support the delivery of evidence-based practice by providers would go to the R01. Whereas a systems level intervention would utilize a number of implementation strategies to get at better access to care, better quality of care, Good examples of that are the collaborative care studies for depression, as well as the coordinated specialty care for early psychosis. So these are usually packaged interventions that address a number of factors that we know interact in a very specific way to impact the quality, accessibility, fit for purpose of interventions that are already found to be effective. We already know what the mechanisms are for those specific person level interventions. We're just trying to get those out into the field, and we need to understand how to address the system and service barriers for that. The next question is the R6133 considered similar to the R01 budget type? It is uncapped, so very similar, except for you will have a budget for the R61 phase and then a budget for the R33 phase. Okay. Are technical innovation projects using unconventional brain imaging and AI something that would be considered by the program? Is it suitable to submit without any preliminary data? You ask a very important question. It's one that we're grappling with here. I think it really depends on what you mean by, let's say, AI or how AI is being utilized, and the amount of data that's available to support its effectiveness. So, for instance, if you are looking at AI to support an evidence-based treatment, we see that as optimization of an intervention using mathematic or engineering principles, and that would come to us, or might, depending on how much data there is. So if you still need to, you've got proof of concept, right? So you've got some preliminary signal in your intervention, that would go to the efficacy PAR, which we did not discuss here. And so you'd need to test the efficacy first of that intervention before you put it into a test of its effectiveness, which would be much more at a population or specific population level kind of study. If you've got that efficacy data, you know that at least in a smaller kind of study, you've got some enough data to kind of convince the FDA that this is something that is safe. Then you could consider the effectiveness PAR. Joel, do you want to add anything to that, or Mary?
No, I think that's great. I just think that the question also included unconventional brain imaging. If this is a procedure that's not been tested or demonstrated efficacious, as Dr. Arian said, there are other announcements that are appropriate for initial treatment development and testing.
Okay. Okay, and then yes, so from Michelle Padley asking if the slides will be available after the webinar. They will be, and we will be putting them out there, letting you know as soon as we can where those slides are posted. Okay. The next one is from Sarah Jackson. For clarification, if someone hypothetically applied for the pilot hybrid, would they still be eligible for the full 5-year follow-up, e.g. the effectiveness, or would they need to complete the effectiveness component in only 2 years, a total of 5, which or technically a total of 8? So I think if I understand your question correctly, if you apply for the R01 for the pilot effectiveness and you find you collect feasibility data, it's very similar to the R34. It's just that the budget's increased. And the requirement for the hybrid trials is for both R01s, for the pilot effectiveness and for the full test of effectiveness. So you could theoretically apply for a 5-year, but you need to justify the timeline like you would in any application. Okay. And let's see. Then there's one from an anonymous participant. I'm submitting a grant due on January 30th. Do I use the new Forms I, or as I've been currently working on the forms? Joel?
So I'm not sure that the announcements we're talking about have January 30th receipt dates. You might be talking about another funding opportunity announcement or notice of funding opportunity. I follow the guide instructions for that are attached to the mechanism you're using in the announcement. For the announcements that we're talking about today, they all have receipt dates after January 25th, 2025, and they will use the Forms I. If any of our colleagues in DEA want to elaborate, we welcome additional input.
That is
Okay.
correct. They all have February dates, so they will use the Forms I, which are being associated with the app with the packages at this time.
Thank you,
Uh,
Karen.
Thanks. The next question comes from Hannah Frank. Do all of these funding announcements require a clear test of target engagement, as has been the case in past PARs? For the pilot effectiveness, you would be proposing that there would be targets that you would be measuring, and you would have to demonstrate the feasibility of being able to do that. In the full-scale effectiveness study, likewise, because you are testing the effectiveness of an intervention, you need to confirm that the targets for that intervention are retained because of the need to test that for novel populations, or adaptations that you may have made to the intervention. That's still required there. For the services interventions, we're interested in the mechanisms that you think that the service intervention is using to address quality, reach, etc. So your measures are going to be less Ardakian, or at the person level. They're going to be more at the systems level. Okay. Um, okay, so for the full-scale effectiveness implementation trial announcement, can you speak to the level of pilot data that is needed? It would be similar to what you would do in any of the RO1s, in the past, where you would need to demonstrate the feasibility of your study design, preliminary proof of concept for the intervention. Nothing's different there. Okay. And then Eric Lenz writes, for the analytic strategy required by the R6133, I'm assuming that the grant needs to provide a strategy to be tested in the R33, not the R61 phase. Correct. And would this be the case that the R61 phase may be used to refine the strategy? Yes. So the main test of the intervention effect is in the R33. The R61 is used for things like partnership building, making sure that you can actually extract electronic health record data, making sure that the ability to actually do the implementation strategies, or the service package is feasible. It's that timeline you need to work out those kinks. And including, is it feasible to, if you still wanted to test the effect of I mean, theoretically, the interventions that you're testing already have gone through that effectiveness test and reconfirmation of the target mechanism. But if you wanted to continue to measure other things like that, you could use the R61 phase to determine the feasibility, the burden, et cetera, of that for the R33 phase. And a second question from Eric is wondering about the changes to peer review framework. The framework, can it be done? Should it be done? Makes a lot of sense. What motivated NIH level change? And I think Karen might be better to answer that question.
Thanks, Pat. I appreciate that. Give me a second. Let me get on video. It's a fair thing to do. Ah. Okay, well, my video won't come on. So the change has been done. The impetus for that was to address review bias and looking at finding ways to reduce reviewer burden, but also bias in the review process. So you'll notice with the retooling of the Section 5, so there are no longer questions but statements, but they're trying to find a better way to get at the information that's necessary without introducing bias to the best of their ability. So you I would say something that Joel had mentioned before, making sure you look at each section. I would hone in on sections 4 and 5 explicitly when you're looking just to understand exactly what is necessary to answer the call for the particular funding announcement. So do hone in on what is being asked of you and what the reviewers are going to be evaluating you on. And that is really the impetus for the change in NIH, is trying to really make sure that the science and the merit of the science is being focused on, as opposed to the individual or the individual institution. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Let's see. And then Tamara, thank you, Tamara, for putting this in the chat in the Q&A regarding the submitting the application via Assist. The NIH has a training site with a video showing how to submit the application via Assist, and Tamara has kindly put the link to that in the Q&A. Which you can hopefully screenshot or maybe even hover over to put it into your browser history. And then Eileen's also put in the chat more details about the NIH government policy and compliance for topics around peer review. If you want to read more about the process that came about for changing the review criteria. There's also a link there. I'm hovering over it, and it looks like you can click on it and put it in your browser history. And then finally, we have another question. Why do we continue to focus on efficacy in population rather than on individuals? I'm not sure what the question is asking, but my interpretation or my answer is that we do test, intervention efficacy at the individual level, and we test the effectiveness of those interventions at the population level. The rationale for focusing on individuals is to determine what the safety, effectiveness, efficacy issues are for that intervention. At the population level, we're interested in how to best reach, or what the differential effects are of treatment across populations, as well as ways to make sure that people can get access to high quality care. All right. So not seeing any other questions. Any final thoughts from our crew? Well, thank you very much for your time. And again, I apologize for the last minute notification, but glad to see, very good attendance here. And we will be sending out a link soon with the slides and a recording of this webinar. Thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of your day.